So you have studied the Vietnam War topic. You know about the Domino Theory, the strategic Hamlet Program, UE helicopters, Operation Rolling Thunder, Agent Orange, Napalm, Search and Destroy, Ho Chi Minh Trail, Cu Chi Tunnels, Tet Offensive, and the Vietnamization. You have written a brilliant essay on the Vietnam War. You know it inside out, so when a new question appears in your exam, you think, perfect, I'll just use the same essay. But when you get your essay back, it's a level 4. That decision would have cost you more marks than you realized. The mistake isn't your knowledge, it's the generic essay trap. Most learners write the same story regardless of the question. But the markers are not looking for a story, they are looking for an answer to the command words. In this video, we are going to show you exactly how to take that generic content and remold it into a good essay to demonstrate how command words demand that you delete some facts and amplify others. Let's turn that level 4 into a level 7. We do this by exploring this essay question. Explain to what extent the technological superiority of the United States Army could not help to defeat a small army of Viet Cong guerrillas in the Vietnamese War between 1962 and 1973. Before we tackle it, we need to address the costly mistake of using one generic Vietnam War essay to answer every variation of the question you encounter. Let's be clear about what we mean by a generic essay. It is an essay you write once, memorize, and then reproduce almost word for word, regardless of what the actual question asks. Students do this because it feels safe, familiar, and efficient. In reality, it is none of those things in an exam. This is the reason why some students walk out of an exam room confident that they have nailed the essays, only to be disappointed by the results or marks they actually get. So why does the generic essay fail? Examiners deliberately design questions with different angles, emphasis, and command words. Look at these two questions side by side. Question A reads, the tactics and strategies that the USA used between 1963 and 1975 against Viet Cong during the war in Vietnam were a dismal failure. Do you agree with the above statement? Use relevant examples to substantiate your line of argument. Question B reads, the USA lost the war in Vietnam between 1962 and 1975 due to unconventional strategies of guerrilla warfare and environmental factors on the battlefield. Do you agree with the above statement? Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. At first glance, these questions look almost identical. Same war, same period, same two sides. But they are asking completely different things. For question A, as we decide whether to agree, disagree, or partially agree, it should be noted that while arguing that the USA tactics caused some considerable damage, the overall strategic approach was a dismal failure because what was intended by the United States, that is containing communism, was never achieved. Even though there was considerable damage caused by the USA, one should question whether the damage worked in favor of the USA or against it. Although some tactics had partial success, such as the Phoenix program that disrupted the Vietcong infrastructure significantly, and the Tet Offensive, which was a military defeat for the Vietcong, they however failed to defeat the Vietcong in the broader scope of the war and in terms of preventing communism. The question is asking us to evaluate the effectiveness of American military tactics and strategies. The main focus and emphasis should be on the specific military tactics and strategies, such as search and destroy missions that involved Operation Rolling Thunder, Operation Junction City, the strategic Hamlet Program, napalm and chemical warfare, which involved the use of Agent Orange and herbicide campaigns, the use of body counts as a measure of success, the Phoenix program, and the Vietnamization policy under Nixon. We are then required to judge or assess the effectiveness of each tactic. Did it achieve its military objective? Was it counterproductive? Did it alienate the civilian population? Did it fail to adapt to the enemy? The candidates can be permitted in a limited way to simply state the Vietcong strategies against which the USA tactics and strategies were intended to counter. The arguments in the essay should not dwell much on the Viet Cong tactics, but on USA tactics and strategies. The second question, question B, which states that the USA lost due to guerrilla warfare and environmental factors between 1962 and 1975, requires a different approach. The question accepts the outcome that the USA lost the war as a given. It is thus asking the candidates to evaluate the causes or reasons for that loss, specifically whether guerrilla warfare tactics by the Viet Cong and the environmental or geographic factors were the primary explanation for the US loss. Unlike the first question, which was focusing on the effectiveness of the US tactics and strategies, the second question's focus shifts to causes. The candidates will need to examine Viet Cong guerrilla tactics, that is the use of the Ho Chi tunnels, ambushes, booby traps, hit-and-run warfare, blending with civilians. Environmental factors will include the jungle terrain, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, monsoon seasons, the unfamiliarity of American troops with the landscape. Candidates will then need to explain and judge whether these factors caused the US defeat. However, a good essay will also consider other contributing factors apart from the guerrilla tactics and environmental factors. Or alternatively, the essay will weigh guerrilla tactics and geographic factors on one hand against other factors. These other factors would include domestic opposition and anti-war movements in the USA, political failures, the failure of the South Vietnamese government, that is the ARVN weakness and corruption, media coverage and loss of public support after Tet Offensive, congressional pressure, and diplomatic factors such as the Paris Peace Accord. So the pitfalls to avoid when answering questions on the Vietnam War topic are students confusing different essay questions like the two questions just discussed as similar and then writing the same essay to answer different questions. If you write one essay and submit it for both questions, you will answer one of them well and the other one poorly because your argument, your evidence, and your structure will be pointing in the wrong direction. Examiners are trained to spot exactly this. They will penalize an answer that ignores the specific demands of the question in front of it. You will notice that some of the same historical facts appear in answers to both questions. That is completely normal. The facts of the Vietnam War do not change depending on the question. What does change is the role those facts play in your argument. Question A and B look almost identical. Same war, same period, same two sides. And yes, some of the same historical facts will appear in both answers, but they are asking fundamentally different things. Question A puts the spotlight squarely on America. It asks you to evaluate whether the tactics and strategies the USA itself employed, such as the search and destroy missions, napalm bombing, the strategic Hamlet Program, Agent Orange, were a failure. The argument relies on what America did and whether those actions worked. Question B shifts the spotlight to the Viet Cong. It asks you to explain whether America lost because of what the Viet Cong did, that is, their guerrilla tactics, their use of jungle, the tunnel networks, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, combined with the environmental conditions that made Vietnam such a hostile battlefield for a conventional army. Now, let's demonstrate how the same facts can serve two completely different purposes. Take the Ho Chi Minh Trail as the first example. In question A, you would use the Ho Chi Minh Trail to show that America's strategy of cutting off Viet Cong supply lines failed. Despite years of aerial bombardment, the USA could not destroy the trail. This becomes evidence that American tactics were ineffective, thereby supporting the argument that their strategies were a dismal failure. In question B, you would use that same exact fact, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to show that the Viet Cong's unconventional strategy of maintaining a hidden jungle-covered supply route through Laos and Cambodia succeeded in sustaining their war effort against a technologically superior enemy. Here it becomes evidence of Viet Cong's strategic brilliance and the role of terrain and environment in frustrating American power. Take the jungle terrain and environment as a second example. In question A, the jungle is evidence that America failed to adapt its strategies to the battlefield. Sending conventionally trained soldiers into dense jungle terrain against an enemy that lived and fought there was a strategic miscalculation. America's failure to adjust is the point. In question B, the jungle is one of the central reasons America lost, not because of anything America did wrong strategically, but because the environment itself was a weapon in the hands of the Viet Cong. The terrain is the point. With these two examples, we see that we have the same facts, the same war, the same jungle, the same trail. We should not forget, as explained earlier, that the same facts serve different argumentative purposes. In question A, these facts are evidence of American strategic failure. In question B, these same facts are evidence of the Viet Cong tactical and environmental advantage. This is precisely why a generic essay cannot serve both questions. The facts do not change, but their argumentative function changes completely depending on which question is in front of you. Reproduce the same essay for both. You will answer one question well and the other question barely at all. Having established that different questions cannot be answered by the same essay and that the same facts serve completely different argumentative purposes depending on the question in front of you, let us now turn our full attention to the specific question we will be addressing in this tutorial. Explain to what extent the technological superiority of the United States Army could not help to defeat a small army of the Viet Cong guerrillas in the Vietnamese War between 1962 and 1973. Before we write anything, we need to read the question carefully and consider what this question is actually asking us to do. Explain means that we do not just state or describe facts and move on. After all, history essays are mainly argumentative and discursive. We need to tell the examiner or marker how and why the facts matter and how they connect to our argument, thereby showing that we understand and not just remember facts. A good essay isn't just a story, it's an argument. To what extent is a request for a degree of measure of how much the statement is true. How far do we agree? This means the examiner wants our judgment. The question is asking how much the American technology failed. Was it a complete failure or a partial failure? Our job is to weigh up the evidence and judge if it is to a greater extent, to a limited or lesser extent, or to some extent. The question is one very specific focus: American technology versus the Viet Cong guerrilla fighters. It is not asking you to write everything you know about the Vietnam War. It is not asking about anti-war protests in America, what the media said, the causes of the war, or political decisions made in Washington. Every paragraph you write must answer this one question: why could American technology not defeat the Viet Cong? If a paragraph does not answer this question, it does not belong in your essay. Leave it out. So what technologies are we talking about? We are talking about advanced weapons, jet aircraft, the B-52s, heavy artillery, UE helicopters, chemical agents, sophisticated communication and logistical technologies. These had the advantage of air mobility and fire support, which allowed rapid deployment, massive firepower, and high survivability in conventional engagements. These capabilities worked in open battles, especially during large operations such as Lam Son, whereby South Vietnamese ground forces could move only because of intensive United States air support. The question also describes the Viet Cong as a small army of guerrillas. That is not an accident or an unnecessary lengthening of the question. The examiner is pointing you directly at the puzzling part of this war. How did the most powerful military in the world, equipped with bombers, helicopters, and chemical technologies such as napalm, Agent Orange, and Agent Blue, fail to defeat a small, lightly armed guerrilla force? That gap between American power and American failure is what our entire essay must try to explain. If students just resort to talking about the US strategies and tactics without identifying the technologies used, they will not be answering the question right in front of them. Even so, we should not simply mention that US technology failed, but rather explore the degree to which it failed and possibly acknowledge areas where it partially succeeded. The question also gives us specific dates. 1962 to 1973. Everything we discuss must fall within those boundaries. We should not drift outside them. To make it easy for students to follow the essay we are writing in response to the question, we shall use the points which learners are already familiar with as guides. These include Operation Rolling Thunder, Operation Range Hand, the Strategic Hamlet Program, Ho Chi Tunnels, Search and Destroy, Tet Offensive, and Vietnamization. We will end up with the following points for our essay: the failure of air power during Operation Rolling Thunder, the failure of chemical warfare, that is, chemical technologies, during Operation Range Hand, the failure of technology in the Strategic Hamlet Program, American technology rendered useless by the Ho Chi Tunnels, the failure of US technology during Search and Destroy, the implication of Tet Offensive with regards to US technology, technological failure during Vietnamization. In our introduction, we need to briefly acknowledge that American technology was powerful by saying that it cannot be disputed to a greater extent that the United States entered the Vietnam War as the most technologically advanced military power in the world, armed with supersonic aircraft, napalm, Agent Orange, and devastating firepower, yet it failed to defeat a comparatively small, lightly armed guerrilla force operating in a developing nation between 1962 and 1973. The goal of this essay is to examine how US technological superiority was rendered largely ineffective by highlighting technological failure during Operation Rolling Thunder, Operation Range Hand, Strategic Hamlet Program, Search and Destroy missions, the Body Count Strategy, Tet Offensive, and Vietnamization. In the face of guerrilla warfare, the geography and environment of Vietnam, the political dimensions of the conflict, as well as the resilience and adaptability of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, while providing evidence thereof. Why did the USA, with its superior military power and technological weapons, fail to defeat the small Viet Cong army? As we write our body paragraphs, we should always have this question at the front of our mind every time we start a new paragraph, so that our essay will stay focused, relevant, and on track. We will discuss specific technologies and explain concretely why each fell short, and analyze the Viet Cong guerrilla tactics and geographical factors which acted as the direct counter to American technology, rendering it ineffective. The United States deployed unprecedented and overwhelming air power in Vietnam, yet this failed completely to break the enemy's will or destroy its capacity to fight. Operation Rolling Thunder demonstrated the limits of technological superiority against a guerrilla enemy. During Operation Rolling Thunder between 1965 and 1968, the United States dropped approximately 864,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, a number which is 3 times more than all sides combined dropped during the entire Second World War. Despite this staggering show of technological power, North Vietnam's capacity to wage war was not broken. The campaign cost the United States over 900 aircraft and more than 1,000 aircrew, without achieving its strategic objectives. The USA believed that sustained heavy bombing would destroy North Vietnamese infrastructure, cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail supply network, and compel Hanoi to negotiate. B-52 bombers flew carpet bombing missions over suspected Viet Cong positions, jungle supply routes, and North Vietnamese targets. However, this strategy was ineffective because it was designed for conventional industrial warfare and was applied against North Vietnam, whose economy was largely agrarian and decentralized, meaning that there were few factories or industrial targets to destroy. When bridges and roads were bombed, mass civilian labor brigades repaired them within days. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, snagged through Laos and Cambodia, was dispersed, heavily camouflaged, and constantly rerouted around destroyed sections. Furthermore, President Lyndon B. Johnson, fearing Chinese intervention, as had occurred during the Korean War between 1950 and 1953, repeatedly restricted bombing targets, rendering the campaign ineffective. The bombing of densely populated areas also killed thousands of civilians, shifting local sympathy decisively towards the Viet Cong and undermining American pacification efforts. It is therefore clear that aerial dominance translated into neither battlefield control nor strategic victory. Technology designed for conventional industrial warfare was powerless against a decentralized guerrilla army hidden in difficult terrain. No bomb, however powerful, can destroy a supply network without a fixed shape or break the will of a population fighting on its own soil. When bombing alone proved insufficient, the United States made extensive use of chemical weapons, Agent Orange and Napalm. This chemical technology was another major example of technological failure of the USA, which brought devastating consequences that strengthened rather than weakened the enemy. The aim of defoliation under Operation Range-Hand was to strip the jungle canopy, denying the Viet Cong the vegetative cover that made them so difficult to target, and to destroy crops that sustained enemy forces. Napalm was deployed against tunnels, Viet Cong positions, and suspected enemy villages. However, these chemical technologies could not distinguish between combatants and civilians. Approximately 20 million gallons of Agent Orange and Agent Blue was sprayed over 4.5 million acres of South Vietnamese land. Defoliation destroyed peasant crops as readily as it cleared jungle canopy, creating widespread food shortages and mass displacement. Rather than being weakened, the Viet Cong adapted by moving deeper into unsprayed jungle, tunneling underground and dispersing supply caches. Agent Orange caused catastrophic long-term health consequences, such as cancers, miscarriages, and birth defects among Vietnamese civilians and American veterans alike, fueling both international outrage and domestic anti-war protests. The Napalm attack on Trang Bang in 1972 became one of the war's most defining moments of moral failure. Nick Ut's 1972 photograph of 9-year-old Pan Thi Kim Phu naked and screaming while fleeing a napalm strike on a village of Trang Bang became one of the most powerful anti-war images in history. Studies later found that an estimated 400,000 Vietnamese people were killed or maimed as a direct result of Agent Orange exposure. It is evident, therefore, that American chemical technology was entirely divorced from the political and moral considerations essential to winning a counterinsurgency. Far from achieving the stated objective of winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, chemical warfare actively alienated the civilian population and handed the Viet Cong a decisive propaganda victory. Technology could burn villages, but it could not win the loyalty of the Vietnamese population. Military technological capability could not win the war, where political and moral considerations were important. American technology failed under the strategic Hamlet Program because it was misapplied to a problem that was political and social in nature rather than purely military. The strategic Hamlet Program was championed by the South Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhuo. The United States provided substantial technological and material support, barbed wire, concrete, radio communications, weapons, and advisors. However, the United States supplied South Vietnamese Hamlet militias with outdated World War II-era technological weapons, unreliable radio equipment, and hastily constructed fortifications, all of which were poorly maintained due to inadequate training and rampant corruption in the supply chain. For example, radios distributed to isolated hamlets frequently broke down with no spare parts available, leaving communities unable to call for military assistance when Viet Cong forces attacked, while weapons and materials regularly fell into enemy hands through raids and defections. This evidence demonstrates that no amount of American-supplied equipment could compensate for the program's deeper failure. The strategic Hamlet Program forcibly relocated peasants from their ancestral and farmlands, making daily farming impossible and placing them into fortified settlements they had not chosen. The United States and the South Vietnamese government generated widespread resentment among the very population they sought to protect and gain allegiance from, ultimately driving many villagers toward the Viet Cong rather than away from them. No amount of American-supplied technology could compensate for this alienation. The Viet Cong often had better human intelligence inside the hamlets than the South Vietnamese government did. American advisors were fed falsified metrics such as hamlet completion rates, population figures, security assessments that made the program to appear far more successful than it was. The United States lacked independent intelligence on the ground to verify these numbers, meaning technological and financial investment was poured into a system whose failure wasn't properly detected until it was too late. Computers and data systems such as the Hamlet evaluation system and the command and control cybernetics were used to quantify pacification, that is, to manage war through statistics and models. This United States approach attempted to convert complex village politics into numerical figures, which distorted the measure of progress of isolating the villagers from the Viet Cong. The United States technologies were being used for purposes completely divorced from realities on the ground because the Viet Cong easily infiltrated the safe villages and blended with the peasants or overrun by the Viet Cong, who had often already embedded themselves within the very communities being relocated. It becomes clear that technology and resources without political credibility are insufficient tools for winning a counterinsurgency. The ingenuity and adaptability of the Viet Cong rendered much of America's technological advantage irrelevant at the tactical level. This was seen in the use of the Ho Chi Tunnel network, spanning over 250 kilometers beneath the jungle of Ho Chi Province, just 40 kilometers northwest of Saigon. The tunnel network was a complete underground military civilization. It housed hospitals, command centers, weapons factories, sleeping quarters, and kitchens equipped with ventilation systems specifically designed to disperse cooking smoke and prevent aerial detection. American forces threw everything at it, including bulldozers, explosives, chemical fumigants, and specially trained soldiers called tunnel rats who crawled into the darkness armed with only a pistol and a torch toward sure death. During the 1968 Tet Offensive, Vietcong forces used the Ho Chi network to launch devastating surprise attacks deep within South Vietnam, emerging, fighting, and vanishing back underground before American firepower could respond. The tunnel system rendered American firepower and technological resources useless. The Viet Cong's knowledge of the terrain, their extraordinary patience, and their willingness to absorb devastating losses in pursuit of a long-term political objective worked. Where American military doctrine emphasized destroying the enemy through firepower, finding him, fixing him, and finishing him, the Viet Cong emphasized survivability, invisibility, and time. These were dimensions in which technology offered the United States no meaningful advantage. You cannot bomb what you cannot find, and you cannot fix an enemy who was never where you expected him to be. This demonstrates the failure of the search and destroy strategy, which assumed that a technologically superior force could hunt down and eliminate an elusive guerrilla army. This was an assumption the Viet Cong proved wrong. The search and destroy strategy, which placed total faith in American firepower and mobility to eliminate the Viet Cong, was not only militarily ineffective but produced atrocities such as the My Lai massacre that catastrophically undermined the American war effort, politically and morally. General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition, that is using superior American firepower, helicopters, and mobility to seek out and destroy Viet Cong forces wherever they were found, reflected a belief that overwhelming technology would eventually exhaust the enemy. However, the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong meant there were rarely clear targets to destroy. The enemy controlled the pace of engagement by attacking when advantaged and melting back into the jungle or the civilian population when threatened. In the absence of clear front lines or identifiable enemy combatants, search and destroy missions frequently targeted entire villages suspected of harboring or sympathizing with the Viet Cong. This led to the destruction of civilian homes, crops, and lives, breeding exactly the kind of resentment that drove rural South Vietnamese into the arms of the communists. The outcome of this approach was massacre. On 16 March 1968, United States soldiers under the command of Lieutenant William Cayley entered the village of My Lai in Quang Nai province on a search and destroy mission. Finding no Viet Cong fighters, the soldiers systematically murdered between 347 and 504 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, and committed widespread rape and mutilation. This triggered massive anti-war protests across the United States and the world. It is clear, therefore, that the search and destroy strategy revealed American faith in their technological and military superiority, which turned out to be self-defeating. Technologically backed firepower without the means to tell who was civilian and Viet Cong guaranteed defeat. The My Lai massacre revealed the magnitude of the failure of US technology. America's technological superiority had failed to achieve military objectives such as territory captured or cities seized. The American military's attempt to adopt the body count as the primary measure of success was based on the logic that if the United States killed enemy soldiers faster than North Vietnam could replace them, the war would be won. In practice, military units were evaluated and promoted on the basis of enemy killed. This created enormous pressure to inflate numbers. Any Vietnamese person killed in a combat zone, civilian or combatant, was frequently counted as an enemy combatant. If it's dead and Vietnamese, it's VC, became a widely reported phrase among US soldiers. By 1967, the United States military reported killing over 220,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army soldiers. If this number was true and accurate, it would have represented the near total destruction of enemy forces. Yet the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive in January 1968, demonstrating that the body count figures were widely inaccurate or meaningless as a measure of strategic progress. By measuring what was easy to count rather than what actually mattered, which was popular support and the will to fight, the United States was guaranteed to fail. A war fought for the loyalty of a people cannot be won by counting corpses produced by superior technological weapons. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 represents proof that military technology can win every battle but still lose the war. During the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, which is traditionally a time of ceasefire, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated surprise attacks on more than 100 cities and towns simultaneously across South Vietnam. Most shockingly, a Viet Cong commando unit breached the walls of the US Embassy compound in Saigon itself, the symbolic heart of American power in Vietnam. American and South Vietnamese forces ultimately repelled every attack, and the Viet Cong suffered with approximately 45,000 killed. In military terms, Tet was an American victory, but winning a battle is not winning the war. For years, the Johnson administration and military commanders had assured the American public with confident statistics and body counts that the war was being won and that the enemy was close to breaking. The Tet Offensive broadcast life into American living rooms, exposed the lie to every one of those assurances. Public support collapsed. Congress turned against the war. President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. It becomes clear that in a conflict shaped by political will, public legitimacy, and endurance, technological superiority cannot compensate for dishonesty. Numbers of the enemy killed meant nothing when the American public could see with their own eyes that the enemy was still fighting, still attacking, and still nowhere near defeat. Vietnamization failed largely because the advanced American technology transferred to South Vietnam created a military that was structurally dependent on foreign support rather than self-sufficient and capable of independent defense. Vietnamization was a US policy during the Vietnam War, introduced by President Nixon's administration in 1969, designed to gradually transfer the responsibility of fighting the war from American forces to South Vietnamese forces. American support would be provided, but without American soldiers doing the fighting. The United States equipped the Army of the Republic of Vietnam with sophisticated weaponry, including F-5 fighter jets, M48 tanks, and M16 rifles, all of which required complex maintenance, a steady supply of spare parts, and extensive technical training that South Vietnamese forces never fully mastered. For instance, when Congress drastically cut military aid funding in 1973 and 1974, following the Paris Peace Accords, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam found itself unable to operate and maintain its high-technology arsenal without American logistical and financial support. This resulted in aircrafts being grounded, armored vehicles becoming immobilized, and infantry units left with a critical shortage of ammunition. This illustrates that Vietnamization was flawed from its inception, as the Nixon administration had confused the transfer of weapons with the transfer of military capability, producing an army that could only function as an extension of American power rather than as a genuinely independent fighting force. This was another weakness the North Vietnamese exploited decisively during their final offensive of 1975. This led to most people believing that Vietnamization was a face-saving strategy which involved the United States exiting a losing war while claiming to have given South Vietnam a fair fighting chance. From the above given arguments, it is conclusive to say that to a very considerable extent, American technological superiority could not overcome the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. The United States did not lose the Vietnam War because its weapons were inadequate. It lost because the Viet Cong offered no targets that the United States technologies could target. The Viet Cong had no factories to bomb, no front lines to break, no capital cities to capture, and no public opinion that American bombing could turn against their cause. Technology could destroy villages, strip jungles bare, and fill the sky with bombers, but it could not win the loyalty of the Vietnamese people, or extinguish the nationalist conviction that drove the Viet Cong to fight on regardless of the costs. The Vietnam War showed that the side with the greater cause, the deeper motivation, and the stronger connection to the people will always prevail over the side with the more technologically powerful weapons. You probably have noticed that some details about the Vietnam War have been left out of this sample essay, as they might not be relevant to the question or line of argument chosen. So from this tutorial, the lesson is simple. A generic essay is not a master key. Every question has a specific focus. Your job is to craft the answer for that specific question on that specific day in that specific exam. Answer the question that is actually in front of you.